Hello and welcome to another episode of Album Musings. So in this week's episode we're going to be taking a look at the debut album by Suede. So Suede by Suede, released on the 29th of March 1993, and this video is being recorded on the 28th of March 2023. So yeah, 30 years old. 4 singles off of this. 3 of them form what Rolling Stone call a triptych of instantly classic singles. That would be The Drowners, Metal Mickey and Animal Nitrate. And I think all of these were actually released before the album release. The earlier ones in 92 and this one just before this album came out. Looking at their discography, you can see here's the debut album, and there's definitely a gap in the catalogue here in terms of the timeline. Massive gap here, and we'll see why in a moment when we look at the timeline above. So here's the album, here's the second album, and here's this gap. So for me, the interesting period is here. So Bernard Butler was the original guitarist in the band. Well, I say the original guitarist, technically it was Justin Frischman, but yeah, the guitarist for this album, I should say more correctly. And there was a lot of friction between Bernard Butler and mainly Brett Anderson. I think there was probably a lot of tension in the band generally. So during the recording of the second album, Bernard Butler leaves the band, and Richard Oakes joins the band. Richard Oakes at the time was only 17 when he joined Suede. The way the timeline looks, remember this sort of lines up with the release of the album. From the limited amount of research I've done on Wikipedia, how it would appear is that Bernard Butler was around and contributed to the recording of the second album, but left before it was released and completed. And so there are some session musicians, I believe, that play on the album. Richard Oakes didn't get involved with the recording of the album at all, or the second album at all, Dogman Star, and it wasn't until coming up in terms of album releases that he features on the album. So sometimes with these timelines you have to be a little bit careful, because this is the release date line, not the recording date line. So just superficially it looks like Richard Oakes played on the second album, but my understanding is that he didn't. It was Bernard Butler, and just the way the timing was against the recording and the release, that's why you get these anomalies. And here, the band disbanded and then reformed with this lineup with Richard Oakes on guitar and Neil Codling here as well. Looks like a number of things: rhythm guitar, keyboards, backing vocals, a multi-instrumentalist. So moving on, you can see here, this is the original track listing. We've got all these remastered and expanded versions that we're seeing a lot of now, both as a result of the CD era and as a result of the streaming and download era. A lot of interesting stuff sometimes comes up, like we've got things like here an early demo with Justin Frischman, who went on to form Elastica. But again, with quite a lot of these albums, I've not listened through to this whole one, so I can't really comment on this. But you get a lot of this stuff where it's just filler, and well, if it was that great, why wasn't it released at the time, sort of thing. But it is interesting to often hear the demos, and not specifically in the case of this album, but often in the case of albums that happen in a transition. like I've always been fascinated. It's not a band of the same era, but UFO. There's some interesting recordings of Michael Schenker era UFO. These are live recordings where also there's Paul Chapman, who was ultimately his replacement, but had been in and out of the band a couple of times, also playing alongside Schenker as a rhythm guitarist. So that's always interesting to hear. And so sometimes it is fascinating with, like I say, particularly albums that were recorded in a volatile history in the band. You sometimes hear some other tracks included where there's different musicians playing on it. Another good one is there's an obscure Peel Sessions recording of the Skids, I think it is, where for some reason Stuart Adamson didn't make the session, and there's John McGeoch, not John McLaughlin, the classic guitarist, John McGeoch, actually playing on some Skid songs. So yeah, always keep your eyes open on Spotify. This is where I'm going with this, and don't always dismiss some of these demo tracks. You know, it's always interesting to listen to the Peel Sessions for UK bands as well, if there are any. Like I said, you get these interesting things crop up at the time of the session like that. So anyway, back to the band in question. So for the album, yeah, there are 4-piece for this album. Additional musicians, you can see there's a string section in here alongside a few other things. Charts and certifications easily fit this on one screen. So, yep, number 1 in the UK album charts for the debut Suede album. Went gold, and you can double check a lot of these figures on various sites as well to see how up to date they are, so that's always handy. On Album of the Year, so second on the list according to their popularity algorithm or calculation. Interesting to see the recent release by the reformed band is right up there. It's got a blue star. So looking at their single releases first, you can see these are the 4 singles off the album. I believe this is a non-album release between the first and second albums. And then we've got stuff of the second album here. And then later stuff after Bernard Butler left. But yeah, nothing singles wise in the more recent era of the band. So first 4 singles there. This one's slightly outside the top 40, and then these start getting in. Interesting to know, even I think in the late 90s they were still having top 10 singles success. So yeah. I also find this era, the guitar sound is slightly gnarlier, which isn't to everybody's taste, but I quite like it. Album wise, yeah, it's great when your first album, your debut album, goes to number 1 in the UK. And we get third album, number 1, 5th, number 1, and so on. So yeah, again, album-wise, we're seeing top 10 chart success. Admittedly, here we're getting into the era of download and streaming, but yeah, it's interesting to see their chart performance. So moving on to the singles individually, we've got The Drowners. So this was released in 92, the previous year from the album coming out. 11th of May. So we can see outside the top 40. But let's just see what it was alongside at that point. So we've got Guns N' Roses, Knocking on Heaven's Door, Ugly Kid Joe, Shakespeare's Sister, 2 Unlimited. This is really the period to me of Eurodance, I think they were calling it, but there may have been some non-European bands that had a similar musical style, but this sort of electronic dance, slightly higher tempo stuff that was really popular. Interesting to see, previous episode we've been talking about Marillion from 83. We've got a Marillion single here from 93. Metallica, Nothing Else Matters is coming down the charts. Saint Etienne, Future Sound of London, Mr. Big, The Cure. Oh yeah, I remember that being big at that time. Friday, I'm in Love. Temple of Love by the Sisters of Mercy. Yep, from 92. And there we have The Drowners. Metal Mickey, second single, 14th September 92. Number 17 in the charts. This is a great week on the charts. So we've got Ebenezer Goodbye the Shaman, It's My Life by Dr. Alban, Snap Rhythm is the Dancer, Brian May's in the charts, Manic Street Preachers, E17, The Prodigy, Tasmin Archer, Pearl Jam with Jeremy, there's Metal Mickey. We've got Def Leppard in here, Crying Game by Boy George, I'm assuming that's from the film. How Soon Is Now by The Smiths from 92. It's Only Natural by Crowded House, In Excess, Delamitri, Bryan Adams, Happy Mondays, Dancing Queen by ABBA, the list just goes on. Orbital, and so on. So yeah, it definitely made me smile when I first saw this. Unfortunately, this is about my fourth attempt at recording this for various reasons. So yeah, that's fairly rare on the channel. Animal Nitrate, the third single, 22nd of February 1993, so still before the album's released. So number 7 got to 2 weeks at number 7, and let's see what was kicking around there. So To Unlimited, Michael Jackson, Lenny Kravitz, Shaggy, Whitney Houston, there's Suede there, Depeche Mode, E17, Madonna. Yeah, I think, well no, I've said this already, 79, the favourite year of mine in music, 93, yeah, and we've got, stuff still kicking around from albums that I've spoken about previously, so Rage Against the Machine, Killing in the Name was out, so yeah, 93, great year. Stereo MCs, Harvest Moon by Neil Young is in the charts, wow. I wonder if that was off the back of. So Young by Suede. So I think this is my favourite single from the album, even though it didn't do so well. Did get into the top 40 just for 1 week, got to number 22 and then just bounced back out again. And this was released after the album. So I suppose you could say, well, once people had got the album, maybe it's like, it's likely that the single's not going to do so well anyway. House of Pain, Jump Around, In These Arms, Bon Jovi, R.E.M. Got Ace of Base, All That She Wants, that was a massive hit. Civil War EP by Guns N' Roses, Two Princes by the Spin Doctors. Again, it's another week or another era in the UK charts which I have real strong memories of. Yeah, Utah Saints, Believe in Me. There's So Young, more Saint Etienne, Stereo MCs, Tears for Fears. We're having a bit of a resurgence around this time. Brian Ferry. Some of this stuff cropping up. We've got Living in the Past by Jethro Tull, like a 1993 release. Wasn't that the year that album did really well? And wasn't there some thing because it had pushed Metallica out from doing well at some particular award for the Black Album? Yeah, maybe that's what it's a result of. There was an album by Jethro Tull around this time. Yeah, my memory's a bit faded. If anybody can remember that's watching this, can you just confirm that if I'm right? There was that whole big thing about Jethro Tull. Did they push them out of the Grammys or something? It was just a weird situation in terms of like best album. But yeah, I could have got that wrong. Or Young at Heart by the Bluebells. Some of these things, like Young at Heart, have been in and out of the charts because they were used on various adverts for things, and I'm sure I brought that up before. So those are the singles. One thing I wanted to mention before I chat a little bit around albums that I didn't do, or I could have done this week but didn't, is this, the Rock Family Trees, The Birth of Cool Britannia episode. It's still up on YouTube after 10 months. So yeah, track it down. It's really interesting. There's quite a bit about Suede in it, obviously. The other one to try and track down, and I can't really find it in any meaningful form anymore, it's out there, is there's another documentary about Suede, specifically. I think it's something like The Insatiable Ones, something along that line. It's a play on one of their single titles, and it comes and goes. But it's well worth watching. There are some clips of it, but the Justine Frischmann sections in it are really interesting as well. And of course, with some of this, I've noticed a bit of crossover. Some of the clips in other documentaries about Britpop sometimes crop up in other documentaries about Suede. And this is worth checking out as well. I've got this on DVD actually, so I've never bothered watching it on YouTube. Is the Live Forever documentary as well. But I will include a link to this Rock Family Trees. Now, stuff that I could have stuff that I could have spoken about but didn't, that came out in this period at certain critical decades. So starting off in 73, you can see we've got Houses of the Holy, came out this week. Other albums where it's not clear, at least on Wikipedia when they release, $1 Billion Babies, sort of thing. If we go into April, there's those Beatles compilations, and I wouldn't normally speak about compilations, but I just wanted to mention that. And then Aladdin Sane, Catch a Fire, Desperado. Moving on to 83. And previously we'd looked at Marillion. Last week's episode was a 73 episode, was obviously Pink Floyd. And if we scroll back, it's this weird thing in here because, that it's got it the first, but it was released in the UK on the 16th. Anyway, I digress. So yeah, 83, Eliminator, well, I suppose that's the week before. And I was tempted to talk about that as well, because to me, I was already aware of ZZ Top, but it got me back into them, this album, and their sound changed quite dramatically for that album. And we had a copy of this in the house, both on, I think one of my brothers had a copy on vinyl, and I had it on cassette at some point. And then we've got Lap of Luxury, Savatage. I wasn't aware of them then. I actually went to see them in London supporting, I was there primarily to see Halford in 2000, and they were actually the support band there, and I didn't realise they'd been kicking around since 83. And that's the other thing I wanted to mention. We've got Let's Dance in 83, but also It by Pulp. And a lot of bands were retrospectively shoehorned into the Britpop label. Pulp was one of them, But they'd been kicking around since '83. This is their debut album. So a full 10 years before we get into the era of Britpop. Okay, moving on to here, which is 93. So the period of today's episode. There's Suede. We've got Home Invasion by Ice-T. And, another Sabotage album. As we move into April. In 2003, Viva Emptiness by Catatonia. Probably another one I could have spoken about, although I don't think they had any UK chart success. Well, at least not singles anyway. But I bought that album when it came out. Oh, and of course Meteora by Linkin Park. Bought that within about a year. I did buy that when it came out. Oh, Windier album. Again, not so good when you're talking about the UK charts, some of these. Sleeping with Ghosts by Placebo if we get into April. Because we're currently this is currently the last week in March of 2023. And then for 2013, I'm sort of less likely to cover this year. Just because I'm less familiar with chart exposure in the UK, because I'd already moved to Nova Scotia by this time and was really listening to all my music through streaming. But one album I did notice, which a band I've mentioned before, this is a Mir album, MEIR, by Falatak. Bring Me the Horizon, Sempiternal. Yeah, cool. So always interesting to see what I missed or chose not to cover, but I really wanted to cover this album because at the time, I was so exposed to Britpop and buying a lot of stuff that was pre-Britpop period as well. So stuff like bands like Lush, who are part of shoegaze, and also some people see Britpop as a reaction to or an alternative to grunge. So I, previous to this, I'd bought, the debut albums by Nirvana and, everybody else that was sort of involved with that whole period. So albums by Soundgarden as well and Pearl Jam. So yeah, interesting times indeed. Thanks very much for watching. Bye for now, and I will catch you in the next episode.